The examination chamber aboard the Nexus station hummed with alien frequencies, each species' medical equipment adding its own discordant note to the symphony of advanced technology. Dr. Kethvar's 4 elongated fingers moved across the holographic interface with practiced precision, calibrating the deep tissue scanner for what promised to be another routine pre-deployment physical. The Velthari physician had conducted thousands of these examinations over the past decade, cataloging the biological weaknesses and strengths of every species that served in the Galactic Defense Coalition. Humans, in his extensive experience, were disappointingly predictable: fragile bone density, limited regenerative capabilities, and a cardiovascular system that bordered on the primitive. Subject designation? Kethvar's translator rendered his clicking consonants into standard galactic, though he barely looked up from his instruments as he spoke. Davidson, James. Sergeant, 3rd Expeditionary Force. The human's voice carried that typical Earth accent, flat, unrefined, lacking the harmonic undertones that marked truly evolved speech patterns. Kethvar finally glanced at his patient, taking in the unremarkable features that defined the species: pale skin marked by those peculiar follicles they called hair, small eyes set in a narrow skull, and that bizarrely limited range of facial expression. This particular specimen appeared to be in his early 30s, standard human years, with the kind of build that suggested regular physical conditioning, but nothing that would impress a Velthari warrior caste. The scanner's preliminary readings confirmed Kethvar's expectations: bone density within normal human parameters, which was to say, embarrassingly low compared to most coalition species; muscle mass adequate but unremarkable. The usual collection of human medical markers that spoke to a species still struggling with genetic limitations their more advanced neighbors had overcome millennia ago. Kethvar made his standard notations, already composing the report that would likely recommend the human for support roles rather than frontline combat deployment. "Remove your upper garments," Kethvar instructed, adjusting the scanner's penetration depth for a more detailed analysis. The deep tissue examination requires direct contact with the epidermis. Davidson complied without comment, pulling off the standard issue coalition uniform shirt with economical movements. Kethvar barely registered the action initially, focused as he was on calibrating the medical sensors for maximum accuracy. The Velthari prided themselves on thoroughness, a trait that had made them the coalition's premier medical researchers and strategic analysts. Every biological weakness would be cataloged, every structural flaw documented with scientific precision. The scanner's beam activated with a low whine, penetrating layers of human tissue to map the internal architecture of Davidson's torso. Kethvar expected to find the usual collection of minor injuries common to coalition soldiers, perhaps a few hairline fractures that had healed improperly, some muscle scarring from training accidents, maybe evidence of the respiratory infections that plagued humans in mixed atmosphere environments. What the scanner revealed instead made him pause, his secondary eyes blinking in confusion while his primary gaze remained fixed on the holographic display. The human's torso was a roadmap of violence, not the superficial damage of training mishaps or minor combat encounters, but the deep, fundamental trauma of someone who had been systematically destroyed and rebuilt. Twice. The scanner's analysis showed layer upon layer of scar tissue, each one telling a story of wounds that should have been fatal. A puncture wound through the left lung that had somehow missed the major arteries by millimeters, blade cuts across the abdomen that had sliced through muscle and fascia but miraculously avoided severing the spinal column, burns that had penetrated to the subcutaneous layer and healed with the kind of precision that suggested either miraculous luck or surgical intervention under battlefield conditions. But it was the pattern of healing that truly confounded Kethvar. Each wound showed evidence of having been reopened, damaged again, and then healed a second time. The scar tissue had a distinctive layered quality that spoke to repeated trauma to the same areas, as if Davidson had suffered identical injuries on multiple occasions and somehow survived both. The Velthari physician had never seen anything like it in 40 years of medical practice. "Fascinating," Kethvar murmured, his voice taking on the kind of clinical interest reserved for truly unusual specimens. The scanner indicates multiple instances of severe trauma to the same anatomical locations. "This is unprecedented." Davidson's response was a slight shrug, the kind of gesture that humans use to indicate indifference or resignation. "War's messy, Doc. Sometimes you get unlucky more than once." Kethvar's head tilted at an angle that indicated deep thought, a Velthari gesture that translated roughly to skepticism. "These injuries should have been fatal. The probability of surviving one such encounter approaches statistical impossibility. To survive two identical patterns of trauma." He paused, running the calculations through his enhanced neural cortex. "The mathematical likelihood is so remote as to be essentially meaningless." The medical bay's atmospheric recyclers cycled with a soft hiss, replacing the stale air with the kind of precisely controlled mixture that kept dozens of different species comfortable on the same space station. Through the reinforced viewports, the distant glow of Nexus Prime cast long shadows across the examination chamber, highlighting the alien architecture that had become as familiar to Coalition personnel as their homeworlds. This was the heart of galactic civilization, a place where dozens of species worked together toward common goals, each contributing their unique strengths to the greater good. Humans, in Kethvar's professional opinion, had always been something of a puzzle in that regard. They lacked the physical prowess of the Karathi, the intellectual capacity of the Velthari, the technological sophistication of the Zephani, or the spiritual discipline of the Mindari. Their contribution to coalition efforts was generally measured in enthusiasm rather than capability, a willingness to attempt tasks that more sensible species would decline, combined with a strange persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. Looking at Davidson's scan results, Kethvar began to wonder if he had been underestimating that particular human trait. The pattern of injuries suggested someone who had not merely survived violent encounters, but had somehow managed to return to combat readiness after wounds that should have ended his military career permanently. The first time could be attributed to medical intervention and luck. The second time bordered on the miraculous. "I'll need to conduct a more detailed examination," Kethvar announced, activating additional scanning protocols. These readings may indicate unusual regenerative properties that could be valuable for coalition medical research. Davidson's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested the kind of wariness that Kethvar had seen in predatory species when they sensed a potential threat. "Whatever you need, Doc. Just remember that I've got a deployment briefing in 2 hours." The enhanced scans revealed even more disturbing details. The human skeletal structure showed evidence of multiple breaks that had healed with perfect alignment, not the kind of rough reconstruction typical of field medicine, but the precise restoration that required either advanced surgical techniques or natural healing capabilities far beyond normal human parameters. His cardiovascular system bore the marks of massive blood loss on multiple occasions, yet the heart muscle showed no signs of permanent damage. Most remarkably, his nervous system appeared to have developed redundant pathways around areas of previous trauma, as if his body had literally rewired itself to function despite catastrophic injury. "These readings are unprecedented," Kethvar admitted, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration that rarely colored his interactions with other species. "I have observed thousands of soldiers from dozens of worlds, and I have never encountered regenerative capabilities of this magnitude. Your medical records indicate standard human physiology, yet these scans suggest adaptation that approaches the level of engineered enhancement." Davidson remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the far wall of the examination chamber, where a holographic display showed the current deployment map of coalition forces across 17 sectors. Red indicators marked areas of active conflict, yellow showed regions of political instability, and the rare patches of green indicated the peaceful zones where diplomacy still held sway over warfare. It was a map that changed daily, sometimes hourly, as the coalition struggled to maintain order across a galaxy that seemed perpetually balanced on the edge of chaos. When Davidson finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of those red zones up close. "You want to know about the scars, Doc? They're not from enhancement programs or genetic modification. They're from doing what needed to be done when everyone else said it was impossible." The simplicity of the statement somehow made it more unsettling than any elaborate explanation might have been. Kethvar found himself studying the human's face with new attention, noting details that had escaped his initial assessment. The lines around Davidson's eyes weren't just from age, they were the kind of deep creases that came from squinting through weapon sights and scanning hostile terrain. His hands, which had seemed unremarkable during the preliminary examination, bore the calluses and small scars of someone intimately familiar with weapons and tools. Most tellingly, his posture carried the kind of relaxed alertness that Kethvar associated with apex predators, the confidence of someone who had survived encounters that would have killed others. "I must document these findings," Kethvar said, though he found himself oddly reluctant to reduce Davidson to mere data points in a medical file. "The Coalition Medical Corps will be very interested in understanding how you achieved such remarkable recovery from injuries that should have been career-ending." Davidson's response was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a human expression that Kethvar had learned to interpret as polite dismissal. "Put whatever you want in the report, Doc. Just make sure it clears me for active duty." As the enhanced scanning protocols continued their work, mapping every healed fracture and reconstructed organ, Kethvar began to realize that he was looking at something that challenged his fundamental understanding of human limitations. The medical evidence painted a picture of a soldier who had been broken and rebuilt not once, but repeatedly, emerging from each encounter somehow stronger and more capable than before. It defied everything he thought he knew about human physiology and psychology. The examination chamber fell into a rhythm of mechanical sounds, scanners humming, data processors cycling, atmospheric systems maintaining their precise environmental balance. Through it all, Davidson remained motionless on the examination table, displaying the kind of patience that Kethvar had learned to associate with experienced soldiers. There was something almost meditative about his stillness, as if he had learned to conserve energy for moments when action would be required. "The healing patterns are extraordinary," Kethvar observed, reviewing the accumulated data on his holographic displays. "In several instances, the secondary healing appears to be superior to the original tissue structure. Your left shoulder, for example, shows evidence of complete reconstruction that has resulted in improved joint mobility and strength compared to standard human parameters." Davidson nodded slightly, a gesture that acknowledged the observation without providing additional information. Kethvar was beginning to recognize this as a characteristic human trait, the ability to communicate volumes through minimal responses, leaving others to draw their own conclusions about what remained unspoken. The truth was that Kethvar was drawing conclusions, though they made him uncomfortable. His scientific training demanded evidence and reproducible results, but everything about Davidson suggested experiences that existed outside the realm of controlled studies and peer-reviewed research. The scars told stories of violence and recovery that belonged in the realm of legend rather than medical files. As the final scanning protocols completed their analysis, Kethvar found himself faced with a decision that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the examination. Every instinct of his professional training told him to recommend Davidson for limited duty, to keep such a valuable research subject safe from further injury. But the evidence suggested that this human had not only survived multiple encounters with overwhelming odds, but had somehow thrived in situations that would have destroyed others. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to identify Davidson's weaknesses, he had instead discovered strength that defied conventional understanding. The initial assessment protocols had been designed around the assumption that humans represented the lower threshold of coalition military capabilities. Standard procedure called for careful placement of human personnel in support roles where their limitations would not endanger mission success or their alien teammates. The deep tissue scans were supposed to confirm these assumptions, providing medical justification for keeping humans away from the most dangerous assignments. Instead, Kethvar found himself staring at evidence that suggested some humans might be far more resilient than anyone had imagined. The implications were staggering. If Davidson was representative of human potential rather than an aberration, then the coalition had been systematically underutilizing one of its member species for decades. Your muscle fiber density shows significant variation from standard human norms, Kethvar noted, highlighting specific areas on the holographic display. The development appears to be concentrated in regions that correspond to previous injury sites, as if the healing process somehow enhanced the original tissue structure. Davidson glanced at the display with the kind of casual interest that suggested he had seen his own medical scans before. Bodies adapt, Doc. You survive something once, you get better at surviving it the next time. The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact simplicity that it took Kethvar a moment to recognize the profound implications. If Davidson was correct, if human physiology possessed previously unknown adaptive capabilities that were triggered by extreme trauma, then the medical literature on human limitations would need to be completely revised. I would like to schedule follow-up examinations, Kethvar said, though he suspected Davidson would find ways to avoid such appointments. Longitudinal studies of your healing processes could revolutionize coalition medical understanding. Davidson's smile this time seemed more genuine, though it carried an edge that Kethvar couldn't quite interpret. I appreciate the interest, Doc, but I suspect my healing processes work best when they're not being studied. There was something in that statement that gave Kethvar pause, not just the words themselves, but the way Davidson delivered them. It suggested a level of self-awareness about his own capabilities that went beyond simple experience with injury and recovery. The human seemed to understand something about his own physiology that he was choosing not to share, maintaining professional politeness while keeping crucial information to himself. The examination chamber's chronometer chimed softly, indicating that the scheduled appointment time was nearing its end. Standard protocol called for Kethvar to complete his assessment, file the appropriate reports, and move on to the next scheduled patient. The efficiency of coalition medical services depended on maintaining such schedules, especially on a station as busy as Nexus Prime. But as Kethvar began the process of shutting down his scanning equipment, he realized that he was reluctant to end the examination, not because he needed additional data. The scans had provided more information than he could process in a single session, but because he sensed that he was in the presence of something that might fundamentally change how the coalition understood human capabilities. One final question, Kethvar said, powering down the deep tissue scanner while keeping his attention focused on Davidson's face. The pattern of your injuries suggests combat with specific weapon types and fighting techniques. The precision of the blade wounds, in particular, indicates encounters with species that favor close-quarters combat over ranged weapons. Can you elaborate on the circumstances that led to these injuries? Davidson was silent for a long moment, pulling his uniform shirt back on with movements that seemed somehow more deliberate than before. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality that Kethvar had not heard during the rest of the examination, something harder and more distant, as if he were recalling events from a place he preferred not to visit. Two separate incidents, Doc. Different worlds, different enemies, but similar tactical situations. Both times my unit was tasked with objectives that command considered necessary but impossible, Both times we were told to expect minimal survival rates. Both times someone had to stay behind to make sure the mission succeeded. The simple recitation of facts somehow conveyed more about the nature of Davidson's injuries than hours of detailed medical analysis could have provided. Kethvar found himself reassessing not just the scars visible on the scanner displays, but the human sitting in front of him. The unremarkable exterior concealed experiences that would have broken most individuals, yet Davidson spoke of them with the kind of professional detachment that suggested he had made peace with choices that others might consider unthinkable. "And you volunteered for these assignments?" Kethvar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Davidson's response was that slight shrug again, the gesture that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement and dismissal. Someone had to do it. Might as well be someone who'd already proven he could come back from it. The logic was simultaneously compelling and terrifying. Davidson had survived the unsurvivable once, which had qualified him to attempt it again. The scars that should have been evidence of weakness had instead become credentials for tackling missions that no sane individual would accept. As Davidson stood to leave, Kethvar realized that his assessment report would need to be completely different from what he had planned. The human in front of him did not fit into any of the standard categories that the Coalition used to classify military personnel. He was neither the fragile support specialist that human physiology suggested, nor the enhanced warrior that his scars implied. He was something else entirely, an individual who had found ways to transcend his species' limitations through means that defied medical understanding. "Sergeant Davidson," Kethvar called as the human reached the examination chamber door. "Your deployment briefing. What assignment have you been given?" Davidson paused, his hand resting on the door control. "Extraction mission. Hostile territory, limited support, high probability of casualties." His voice carried no trace of concern or excitement, just the professional acknowledgement of another job to be done. "Standard Tuesday, really?" The door slid shut behind him, leaving Kethvar alone with his instruments and the most confusing medical data he had ever collected. The deep tissue scans painted a picture of a human who had been destroyed and rebuilt twice, yet walked away from the examination as if he were heading to a routine training exercise rather than a mission that would likely produce more scars to add to his collection. Kethvar began the process of documenting his findings, but found himself struggling with how to translate his observations into the standardized language that Coalition medical reports required. How did one categorize a patient whose injuries suggested repeated encounters with impossible odds, yet who displayed no signs of psychological trauma or physical limitation? How did one explain healing patterns that defied current understanding of human physiology without sounding like he was filing a report on mythological creatures rather than medical analysis? The truth was that Kethvar had entered the examination expecting to document human weakness, and instead had discovered something that challenged fundamental assumptions about what humans were capable of achieving. Davidson's scars were not evidence of fragility. They were proof of resilience that bordered on the miraculous. As he compiled his report, Kethvar found himself wondering how many other humans might possess similar capabilities. Were they all products of extreme circumstances like Davidson, or did some human populations harbor genetic potential that the Coalition had never recognized? The implications for military strategy, medical research, and interspecies relations were staggering. But perhaps more importantly, Kethvar realized that he had just encountered his first example of something he had heard about but never witnessed, a human who had learned to transform limitation into strength through sheer force of will and circumstances that would have destroyed others. The scars that marked Davidson's body were not just evidence of survival, they were proof that some individuals could emerge from destruction not just intact, but somehow enhanced. The examination chamber returned to its sterile quiet as Kethvar completed his reports and prepared for the next scheduled patient. but as he calibrated his instruments for what promised to be a routine assessment of a Karathi engineer, he found his thoughts returning to Davidson's parting comment about standard Tuesdays and extraction missions in hostile territory. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Kethavar suspected that he would be seeing Sergeant Davidson again for another examination in the not-too-distant future, and when that happened, he was almost certain that the scanner would reveal new scars to add to the collection, scars that would heal with the same impossible precision and leave Davidson somehow stronger than before. The thought should have been disturbing. Instead, Kethavar found it oddly comforting to know that the Coalition had at least one human who specialized in making the impossible merely improbable. Captain Thainara's bridge briefing room aboard the destroyer Steadfast Resolve buzzed with the low-frequency harmonics that indicated serious tactical discussion among the command staff. The ship's complement of officers represented 5 different species, each bringing their own perspective to the analysis of what promised to be one of the most challenging extraction missions attempted in recent memory. Holographic displays showed 3-dimensional tactical maps of the target zone, with red indicators marking known hostile positions and yellow zones highlighting areas where enemy strength remained uncertain. Davidson sat at the far end of the briefing table, his attention focused on the mission parameters, while the senior officers debated approach vectors and risk assessments. To the casual observer, he appeared to be just another Coalition soldier receiving orders, unremarkable in appearance, quiet in demeanor, displaying none of the physical presence that marked the elite warriors of species like the Karathi or Zafani. The medical examination from the previous day might never have happened, based on his professional composure and apparent readiness for another routine assignment. The target is a Coalition research facility on Kepler 442c, Captain Thainara explained, her crystalline voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding mixed-species crews. Intelligence indicates that Dr. Yilnara and her team were conducting xenoarchaeological research when the planet was overrun by Havoc raiders. Standard protocols would classify this as a loss and move on to other priorities. The Karathi tactical officer, Major Brekthar, shifted his massive frame in the reinforced chair designed to accommodate his species' physiology. Captain, the Havoc rarely take prisoners for extended periods. If the research team survived the initial assault, they would have been processed according to Havoc standard procedures within 48 hours of capture. Thainara's response carried the kind of diplomatic neutrality that senior Coalition officers cultivated when dealing with uncomfortable realities. Intelligence suggests that Dr. Yilnara's team discovered something of significant strategic value. The Havoc appeared to be keeping them alive for interrogation purposes rather than following their usual protocols. Davidson found himself studying the tactical displays with renewed interest. Havoc raiders were known throughout the Coalition for their efficiency and brutality. They struck fast, took what they wanted, and eliminated anything that might slow their withdrawal. If they were deviating from their standard operating procedures, it meant they had found something worth the additional risk and complexity of maintaining prisoners. "What kind of strategic value?" asked Lieutenant Commander Pelris, the Mindari intelligence analyst, whose species specialized in understanding enemy motivations and decision-making patterns. The Havoc are primarily interested in technology and resources that can be quickly monetized or weaponized. Xenoarchaeological research rarely fits either category. Thainara's hesitation suggested that she was about to share information that existed at the edge of official intelligence reports. Dr. Yilnara's team was investigating ruins that predate known galactic civilizations by several million years. Their preliminary reports indicated the discovery of intact technological artifacts with capabilities that our best scientists cannot explain. The briefing room fell into the kind of silence that indicated each officer was running probability calculations through their species' respective cognitive processes. Ancient technology was the kind of discovery that could shift the balance of power between galactic civilizations, assuming anyone could figure out how to use it safely. The Havoc's interests suggested that they either understood the technology better than Coalition scientists or were willing to take risks that more cautious species would avoid. Extraction parameters? Major Brekthar inquired, his voice carrying the professional detachment that marked experienced soldiers discussing dangerous assignments. Standard evacuation protocols are not applicable, Thaynara replied, activating additional holographic displays that showed the planetary surface in tactical detail. Havoc ground forces have established defensive positions around the research facility, with secondary forces controlling all major transportation nodes. Orbital approaches are compromised by automated defense systems that the Havoc have activated using captured Coalition security codes. Davidson studied the tactical situation with growing understanding of why this mission had been classified as high risk. The Havoc had not simply raided the research facility, they had occupied it with the kind of defensive preparations that suggested a long-term operation. They were dug in, well-supplied, and in possession of Coalition security protocols that would make any direct assault extremely costly. Recommended approach? Lieutenant Commander Pelris asked, though her tone suggested that she suspected there was no recommended approach for this type of mission. Thaynara's response confirmed those suspicions. Mission parameters call for a small infiltration team to penetrate Havoc defenses, locate survivors, and extract them without alerting enemy forces to Coalition capabilities in the region. Success depends on avoiding direct confrontation with superior enemy forces while maintaining operational security. The briefing room's atmospheric systems cycled with a soft whisper, replacing stale air with the precisely controlled mixture that kept all species comfortable during extended tactical discussions. Through the reinforced viewports, the twisted geometries of hyperspace streaked past as the steadfast resolve continued toward its destination at maximum sustainable velocity. The visual reminder of their journey served to underscore the fact that they were rapidly approaching the point where theoretical planning would give way to concrete action. Team composition? Major Brekthar asked, though Davidson suspected that question had already been answered before the briefing began. Sergeant Davidson will conduct the infiltration phase, Thaynara announced, her gaze briefly meeting Davidson's before continuing. His recent medical evaluation indicates capabilities that make him uniquely suitable for this type of operation. Davidson felt the attention of the other officers shift to him, though he maintained his focus on the tactical displays. He could sense their confusion, understandable, given that his appearance suggested nothing that would qualify him for a solo infiltration mission against entrenched Havoc forces. The medical scans that had puzzled Dr. Kethvar were apparently being interpreted by command staff as indicators of unusual capabilities rather than evidence of spectacular luck. "Sir," Davidson interjected, his voice carrying the kind of professional respect that indicated he understood the chain of command while reserving the right to express concerns about mission parameters. The tactical situation suggests that a single operator will have limited success against organized Havoc defenses. Their standard protocols call for overlapping security zones and redundant communication systems. Thaynara's response indicated that she had anticipated this concern. Intelligence suggests that the Havoc are operating under resource constraints that have forced them to adapt their standard security procedures. Their primary focus appears to be defending against orbital assault or major ground operations, rather than preventing infiltration by individual operators. The logic was sound, as far as it went. The Havoc were notorious for their efficiency, which meant they allocated resources based on the most likely threats. A single infiltrator represented minimal risk compared to the kind of massed assault that Coalition forces typically mounted against entrenched positions. They might not have bothered with the kind of comprehensive security that would detect someone with the right skills and equipment. "What kind of timeline are we working with?" Davidson asked, recognizing that the planning phase was rapidly giving way to mission preparation. 18 hours until orbital insertion, Major Brekthar replied, consulting his chronometer. The steadfast resolve will maintain position at the edge of the system's detection grid while you conduct ground operations. Extraction window opens 72 hours after insertion, assuming you can reach the designated pickup coordinates. Davidson nodded, filing away the details while running his own calculations about the mission parameters. 72 hours was a generous timeline for most infiltration operations, but the Havoc were known for their adaptability. If they detected his presence, they would modify their security procedures faster than most species could respond to changing tactical situations. Rules of engagement? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Minimal contact with enemy forces, Thaynara replied. This is a stealth operation, not a combat mission. Your primary objectives are locating survivors and establishing communication for extraction coordination. Secondary objectives include gathering intelligence on Havoc intentions regarding the archaeological discoveries. The briefing continued with detailed discussions of insertion methods, communication protocols, and contingency procedures. Davidson absorbed the information with the kind of professional attention that had kept him alive through previous impossible assignments, but part of his mind was already shifting into the mental space that such missions required. The scars that Dr. Kethvar had documented so thoroughly were about to be put to the test once again. As the briefing concluded and officers began dispersing to their respective duties, Davidson found himself reflecting on the irony of his situation. The medical examination that was supposed to identify his limitations had instead qualified him for another assignment that would likely add to his collection of scars. The healing that had puzzled Kethvar was about to face new challenges that would either prove its resilience or finally find its limits. Captain Thaynara approached as he prepared to leave the briefing room. Sergeant Davidson, a moment of your time. Davidson paused, recognizing the tone that indicated a private conversation outside the formal structure of mission briefings. Yes, Captain. Your medical records indicate unusual resilience to combat trauma, Thaynara said, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested she was working from incomplete information. Command seems to believe that this qualifies you for operations that would normally require enhanced personnel or specialized equipment. Davidson waited for her to continue, recognizing that she was building toward a question rather than making a statement. I need to know if you have capabilities that are not documented in your official files, Thaynara said finally. This mission will succeed or fail based on your individual performance, and I cannot afford to send someone into that kind of situation without understanding what they can actually accomplish. The question was reasonable, and Davidson found himself appreciating Thaynara's direct approach. Most commanding officers preferred to work from official documentation rather than asking uncomfortable questions about what might exist beyond the scope of standard personnel files. I heal faster than normal, Davidson replied, choosing his words carefully. I've learned to operate effectively under conditions that would disable most people. I don't have enhanced strength or speed, but I can function through injuries that would put others out of action. Thaynara studied his face with the kind of attention that suggested she was evaluating his words against her own experience with human capabilities. The medical scans show healing patterns that Dr. Kethvar described as unprecedented. That level of resilience suggests capabilities that go beyond normal human physiology. Davidson's response was that slight shrug that had become his trademark gesture for dealing with questions about his unusual characteristics. I've gotten good at staying functional when staying functional matters. Beyond that, I'm just another soldier trying to complete his assignments and get home in one piece. The simplicity of the statement seemed to satisfy Thaynara's concerns, though Davidson suspected she would be monitoring his mission performance more closely than she might with other personnel. Command officers developed instincts about which subordinates could be relied upon in extreme circumstances, and those instincts were usually based on a combination of documented performance and personal observation. "Understood," Thaynara said. "Your insertion will be conducted using stealth pod deployment from the edge of the system's gravity well. Once you're on the surface, you'll be operating with minimal support and communication. The success of this mission depends entirely on your individual capabilities." Davidson acknowledged the responsibility with a brief nod, though he was already shifting his mental focus toward mission preparation. The next 18 hours would be spent reviewing intelligence data, checking equipment, and transitioning into the psychological state that allowed him to function effectively in hostile territory. The scars that had marked his previous encounters with impossible odds were about to face new tests. As he left the briefing room and headed toward his assigned quarters, Davidson found himself thinking about Dr. Kethvar's confusion over the healing patterns revealed by the medical scans. The Velthari physician had approached the examination from a scientific perspective, seeking to understand the biological mechanisms that had allowed such dramatic recovery from traumatic injuries. What Kethvar had not understood, what most people could not understand without experiencing it themselves, was that the healing was only part of the equation. The scars were evidence of survival, but survival alone was not enough to explain how someone could return to combat effectiveness after injuries that should have ended their military career. The real answer lay in the space between destruction and reconstruction, in the moments when the body was rebuilding itself and the mind was learning to function despite damage that should have been overwhelming. Davidson had discovered during his first encounter with near-fatal injuries that consciousness could persist through trauma that would incapacitate others, and that persistence created opportunities that might not exist for someone who succumbed to pain and shock. The second time he had faced similar injuries, he had been able to apply lessons learned from the first encounter. The healing process became more efficient, the psychological adaptation more rapid, and the return to functionality more complete. The scars that resulted were not just evidence of recovery, they were proof of improvement. Davidson settled into his quarters and began the methodical process of preparing for another mission that command considered necessary but impossible. As he reviewed intelligence files and checked equipment specifications, he found himself wondering whether Dr. Kethvar would be available for a post-mission medical examination. The upcoming infiltration operation was likely to provide additional data points for understanding human resilience under extreme conditions. The thought should have been concerning. Instead, Davidson found it oddly reassuring to know that someone was finally paying attention to the capabilities that human personnel brought to coalition operations. If he could survive the next 72 hours and complete the extraction mission successfully, perhaps other humans would be given opportunities to demonstrate similar resilience. The scars that had healed twice were about to face the challenge of healing a third time. Davidson was curious to discover whether the pattern would continue or whether he had finally found the limits of human adaptability. The stealth pod's interior was barely large enough to accommodate Davidson and his equipment, designed with the kind of utilitarian efficiency that prioritized function over comfort. Atmospheric recyclers hummed softly in the cramped space, maintaining a breathable environment during the 6-hour journey from the Steadfast Resolve to Kepler 442c's surface. Through the pod's single viewport, Davidson could observe the gradual transition from the star-filled void of deep space to the growing disk of the target planet, its surface obscured by the kind of dense cloud cover that would provide natural concealment for his insertion. The mission briefing had provided detailed orbital reconnaissance data, but seeing the planet with his own eyes added context that even the most sophisticated sensors could not fully capture. Kepler 442c was a world caught between geological epochs, ancient enough to harbor the ruins that Dr. Yilnara's team had been investigating, but young enough to maintain the kind of active tectonics that would make navigation challenging for anyone unfamiliar with its terrain patterns. Davidson spent the transit time reviewing intelligence files and making final adjustments to his equipment loadout. The gear he carried represented a compromise between capability and concealment, enough firepower to handle unexpected encounters, but not so much that he would be slowed by excessive weight or betrayed by obvious military hardware. The Havoc were known for their ability to detect coalition military signatures, which meant that success would depend more on avoiding contact than winning firefights. As the pod entered the planet's upper atmosphere, Davidson felt the familiar sensation of controlled atmospheric entry, the gradual increase in gravitational forces, the subtle vibrations that indicated contact with atmospheric molecules, and the growing heat signature that would mark his descent to anyone monitoring orbital approaches. The pod's stealth systems would mask most of these indicators, but the Havoc were experienced raiders who understood how to watch for signs of coalition infiltration attempts. The surface insertion went according to plan, with the pod's automated systems delivering him to coordinates in a heavily forested region approximately 15 kilometers from the research facility. The pod's self-destruct sequence activated 30 seconds after touchdown, leaving no evidence of coalition presence beyond the kind of atmospheric disturbance that could be attributed to natural meteor activity. Davidson found himself alone on an alien world, armed with equipment that would need to last him for up to 72 hours of operations behind enemy lines. The forest around him was unlike anything in coalition databases, twisted trees that seemed to grow in impossible spirals, their bark glowing with bioluminescent patterns that shifted in response to his presence. The air carried scents that his human olfactory system could not classify, though his enhanced survival training identified them as indicators of complex organic chemistry rather than immediate toxicity. Kepler 442c's atmosphere was within human tolerance ranges, but the planet's unique evolutionary path had produced an ecosystem that would challenge even experienced xenobiologists. Davidson activated his tactical sensors and began the methodical process of establishing his operational parameters. The research facility lay to the northwest, positioned in a valley that provided natural defensive advantages for anyone controlling the high ground. Havoc forces had chosen their positions well, establishing overlapping fields of fire that would make direct assault extremely costly while maintaining secure communication lines to their orbital support vessels. The intelligence briefing had provided general information about Havoc tactical doctrine, but seeing their actual deployment patterns added important details that would influence his approach to the facility. They were not just defending against potential rescue operations. They were preparing for a prolonged occupation that suggested the archaeological discoveries were more significant than coalition analysts had realized. Moving through the alien forest required constant attention to both natural hazards and potential enemy detection systems. The Havoc were known for their use of automated sensors and patrol drones, though their resources were limited enough that they could not achieve total coverage of the surrounding terrain. Davidson's route toward the facility followed game trails and natural concealment, avoiding the obvious approaches that enemy forces would monitor most carefully. The first indication of Havoc presence came 3 hours into his infiltration, when his tactical sensors detected the electromagnetic signatures of alien communication equipment. A patrol drone passed overhead, its scanning beams probing the forest canopy with systematic precision. Davidson remained motionless beneath the twisted branches of one of the spiral trees, relying on the planet's natural bioluminescence to mask his heat signature, while the drone completed its search pattern. The encounter confirmed that Havoc's security procedures were more comprehensive than intelligence had suggested. They were not simply defending the research facility, they were actively hunting for potential infiltrators across a wide operational area. Davidson revised his timeline estimates and began moving with even greater caution, recognizing that any mistake could compromise not just his mission, but the lives of the research team he was trying to rescue. As he approached the outer perimeter of Havoc defensive positions, Davidson began to understand why this mission had been classified as impossible by conventional standards. The enemy had established interlocking security zones that covered every approach to the research facility, with redundant communication systems that would alert their entire force if any single position was compromised. The kind of frontal assault that coalition forces typically relied upon would result in massive casualties with minimal chance of success. But Davidson was not planning a frontal assault. The scars that Dr. Kethvar had documented were the result of missions that required different approaches, situations where conventional tactics had failed and someone had needed to find alternatives that existed outside standard military doctrine. The healing that had puzzled the Velthari physician was proof that such alternatives sometimes worked, even when they demanded prices that most people would consider unacceptable. Davidson established an observation post in the ruins of what appeared to be an ancient structure predating the current excavation site. The ruins provided both concealment and an elevated view of the research facility, allowing him to study Havoc deployment patterns and identify potential infiltration routes. The archaeological site was more extensive than intelligence reports had indicated, with multiple excavation areas connected by paths that suggested the original civilization had been far more sophisticated than initial surveys had revealed. The research facility itself occupied a natural depression in the center of the archaeological complex, its prefabricated coalition structures contrasting sharply with the organic curves of the ancient ruins. Havoc forces had established defensive positions around the perimeter, with heavy weapons emplacements covering the most likely approach routes. More importantly, Davidson could observe prisoner movement within the facility, clear evidence that Dr. Yilnara's team was still alive and being held for ongoing interrogation. The tactical situation confirmed his suspicions about why this mission had been assigned to a single operator rather than a conventional rescue force. The Havoc were holding their prisoners in the same location they were using as their command center, which meant that any assault would likely result in hostage casualties. The only way to extract the research team safely was to eliminate the guard forces without alerting their command structure, a task that required the kind of precise violence that Davidson had learned to apply during his previous encounters with impossible odds. As darkness fell across Kepler 442c's surface, Davidson began the final phase of his approach to the research facility. The planet's unique bioluminescence provided natural concealment, while the Havoc relied on artificial lighting that created predictable shadow patterns. Their technology was sophisticated, but they were operating in an environment that favored defenders who understood how to use alien terrain to their advantage. The first Havoc sentry never knew what hit him. Davidson's approach had been timed to coincide with a shift change in the perimeter patrols, creating a brief gap in surveillance coverage that allowed him to close within striking distance. The elimination was quick and silent, accomplished with the kind of efficiency that came from extensive experience in close-quarters combat. The body was concealed in a manner that would delay discovery while avoiding changes to patrol patterns that might alert other guards. Davidson worked his way systematically through the outer perimeter, eliminating sentries with the methodical precision that had made him valuable for missions that required surgical removal of enemy forces. Each encounter added to his understanding of Havoc tactical procedures while clearing paths that would be essential for extracting the research team. The scars that marked his body were proof that he had survived similar operations, but each new mission tested the limits of his capabilities in different ways. The inner perimeter presented greater challenges, with overlapping surveillance systems and guard positions that provided mutual support. Davidson was forced to use increasingly creative approaches to eliminate threats without triggering alarm responses. A Havoc communications specialist was eliminated while conducting routine equipment maintenance, his death staged to appear like an equipment malfunction. 2 guards were taken out simultaneously during a patrol overlap, their bodies hidden in maintenance areas that would not be checked until the next shift rotation. By the time Davidson reached the research facility itself, He had eliminated 7 Havoc personnel without triggering any security alerts. The remaining enemy forces continued their normal operations, unaware that their defensive perimeter had been systematically compromised. The approach had required 4 hours of continuous operation under extreme stress, but Davidson's enhanced resilience allowed him to maintain peak performance despite the physical and psychological demands of sustained combat. The facility's interior layout matched Coalition construction standards, though the Havoc had modified security systems and established guard posts at key locations. Davidson's reconnaissance revealed that the research team was being held in what had originally been a laboratory complex, with interrogation sessions being conducted in adjacent spaces. Dr. Yilnara and her 3 colleagues were alive, but showed signs of the kind of systematic questioning that the Havoc used to extract technical information from captured personnel. Davidson established communication with Dr. Yilnara during a brief gap in guard supervision, using hand signals to convey extraction plans while avoiding verbal communication that might be monitored by Havoc surveillance systems. The Mindari scientist's response indicated both relief and concern. She understood that rescue was imminent, but she also recognized that their situation remained extremely dangerous. The extraction required eliminating the remaining guard forces while avoiding damage to research equipment that might contain irreplaceable data about the archaeological discoveries. Davidson moved through the facility with the kind of controlled violence that he had perfected during previous impossible missions, each encounter calculated to minimize noise and maximize efficiency. The Havoc were experienced fighters, but they were not prepared for someone who could absorb significant damage while continuing to function at combat effectiveness. The final confrontation came when Davidson encountered the Havoc commander in the facility's main laboratory, where the alien officer was personally supervising interrogation of Dr. Yilnara. The Havoc commander was a veteran warrior whose species was known for both physical prowess and tactical intelligence, but his experience had not prepared him for combat against someone whose healing capabilities allowed for tactical approaches that would be suicidal for normal individuals. Davidson absorbed multiple hits from Havoc energy weapons while closing to close quarters range, his enhanced resilience allowing him to remain functional despite injuries that should have been incapacitating. The scars that Dr. Kethvar had documented were joined by new wounds that would eventually heal with the same mysterious efficiency, but for now, they served as proof that human determination could overcome superior alien technology when applied with sufficient precision and willingness to accept casualties. The Havoc commander's death marked the completion of the facility infiltration phase, but Davidson recognized that extraction would present its own challenges. Enemy reinforcements would eventually discover the eliminated guards and modified security systems, which meant that the research team needed to be clear of the area before Havoc response forces could organize pursuit operations. Dr. Yilnara and her colleagues moved with the kind of disciplined efficiency that marked experienced researchers who had worked in dangerous environments, but their academic backgrounds had not prepared them for the kind of tactical withdrawal that their situation required. Davidson took point for the extraction movement, using the same infiltration routes he had established during his approach, while maintaining constant awareness of potential enemy response patterns. The withdrawal through Kepler 442c's alien forest tested different aspects of Davidson's capabilities than the facility assault had required. Sustained movement while protecting non-combatants demanded endurance and tactical awareness rather than the explosive violence that had characterized the rescue operation. The injuries he had sustained during the final confrontation continued to affect his performance, but his enhanced healing processes were already beginning the reconstruction work that would eventually eliminate all evidence of damage. 3 hours after leaving the research facility, Davidson and the rescued team reached the designated extraction coordinates where Coalition forces would establish their pickup zone. The stealth insertion that had brought him to the planet's surface would be followed by a more conventional extraction operation, now that the immediate tactical situation had been resolved through direct action rather than continued covert operations. As they waited for the extraction craft to arrive, Dr. Yilnara approached Davidson with the kind of scientific curiosity that marked her species' approach to unexplained phenomena. "Sergeant, your performance during the rescue operation exceeded normal human capabilities by significant margins. Are you enhanced personnel, or do you represent previously unknown human potential?" Davidson's response was the same slight shrug that had become his characteristic way of deflecting questions about his unusual abilities. "I heal fast, and I've learned to work through injuries that would stop most people. Beyond that, I'm just another soldier trying to complete his mission." The simplicity of the explanation did not satisfy Dr. Yilnara's scientific interests, but she recognized that this was neither the time nor place for detailed discussion of human physiology. The extraction craft's approach vector was already visible in Kepler 442c's alien sky, marking the successful completion of another impossible mission that would add to Davidson's collection of scars and medical anomalies. As Coalition forces lifted off from the planet's surface with the rescued research team safely aboard, Davidson found himself wondering whether Dr. Kethvar would be available for another medical examination when they returned to Nexus Station. The mission had provided additional data points about human resilience under extreme conditions, though he suspected that the results would only deepen the mystery rather than providing clear explanations. The scars that had healed twice were about to become scars that had healed 3 times. Davidson was curious to see whether the pattern would continue or whether medical science would finally find ways to understand the mechanisms that made such recovery possible. More importantly, he was already wondering what the next impossible mission would require and whether his accumulated experience with surviving the unsurvivable would prove adequate for whatever challenges Command decided to assign him next. The journey back to the Steadfast Resolve passed in relative silence, with Dr. Yilnara and her research team processing their experiences, while Davidson underwent preliminary medical evaluation by the extraction craft's automated systems. The diagnostic scanners revealed the same kind of systematic damage and ongoing healing that had puzzled Dr. Kethvar, but the field medics were focused on immediate treatment rather than long-term analysis of unusual recovery patterns. By the time they reached the destroyer's medical bay, Davidson's most serious injuries had already progressed through the initial phases of healing that would eventually eliminate all evidence of his latest encounter with enemy forces. The medical staff documented their findings with the kind of professional efficiency that marked Coalition personnel who had learned to work with capabilities they did not fully understand. Captain Thainara's debriefing focused on tactical intelligence rather than medical anomalies, though she made careful note of Davidson's performance parameters for future mission planning. The successful extraction of Dr. Yilnara's team had been accomplished with minimal casualties and maximum intelligence value, representing the kind of operational success that vindicated Command's decision to assign unconventional personnel to impossible missions. As the Steadfast Resolve departed Kepler 442c's system and set course for Nexus Station, Davidson settled into his quarters and began the mental process of transitioning from combat operations back to the routine duties that occupied most Coalition personnel. The physical healing would continue automatically, following patterns that medical science could document but not fully explain. The psychological adaptation would require more conscious effort, as always. The mission had been classified as impossible by conventional standards, but Davidson was beginning to understand that impossibility was often a matter of perspective rather than objective reality. The scars that marked his body were evidence of encounters with situations that should have been fatal, but they were also proof that such encounters could be survived if someone was willing to pay the necessary prices. Dr. Kethvar would undoubtedly want to conduct another detailed examination when they returned to Nexus Station. Davidson found himself looking forward to those discussions, curious to learn whether the Velthari physician had developed new theories about human healing capabilities based on his previous scan results. The scars that had healed twice were about to become the foundation for understanding human potential that the Coalition had never recognized. Davidson suspected that this realization would lead to changes in how human personnel were utilized in future operations, changes that would provide opportunities for his species to demonstrate capabilities that had been systematically underestimated. As the steadfast resolve continued its journey through hyperspace toward Nexus Station, Davidson allowed himself to rest while his body continued the remarkable process of healing that had become his defining characteristic as a Coalition soldier. The next impossible mission was undoubtedly already being planned, but for now he could focus on recovery and preparation for whatever challenges Command would assign him next. The scars would heal, as they always did, and when they did, Davidson would be ready for whatever came next. Dr. Kethvar's examination chamber seemed smaller than Davidson remembered, though he suspected that was due to the additional medical equipment that had been installed since his previous visit. Word of his unusual healing capabilities had apparently reached other Coalition medical researchers, resulting in a comprehensive analysis suite that represented the combined efforts of multiple species' understanding of biological recovery processes. The Velthari physician greeted him with the kind of professional enthusiasm that indicated significant developments in understanding since their last encounter. "Sergeant Davidson, your timing is fortuitous," Kethvar said, adjusting multiple scanning arrays with movements that suggested extensive preparation for this examination. "I have spent considerable time reviewing your previous scan results and consulting with colleagues from other medical specialties. We have developed several theories about the mechanisms underlying your remarkable healing capabilities." Davidson settled onto the examination table with the kind of resigned patience that marked someone accustomed to being studied by medical professionals. The extraction mission from Kepler 442c had added several new scars to his collection, though the healing process was already well advanced by the time he had returned to Nexus Station. Dr. Kethvar would undoubtedly find the latest injury patterns as fascinating as he had the previous ones. "Any particular theories worth sharing, Doc?" Davidson asked, recognizing that Kethvar was building towards some kind of revelation rather than conducting routine post-mission medical evaluation. Kethvar activated the deep tissue scanners with the kind of anticipation that marked researchers who believed they were on the verge of significant discoveries. Initial hypothesis suggested that your healing patterns might represent unknown human genetic potential activated by extreme trauma. However, consultation with Zephani bioengineers and Mindari consciousness researchers has led to more intriguing possibilities. The scanning process revealed the same systematic documentation of injury and recovery that had characterized Davidson's previous examination, but this time the results were being analyzed through multiple theoretical frameworks simultaneously. Holographic displays showed not just the physical evidence of healing, but complex models of how such recovery might be possible given current understanding of biological processes. The most compelling theory involves the intersection of consciousness and cellular regeneration, Kethvar continued, studying the scan results with obvious fascination. Mindari research suggests that sufficiently focused mental states can influence biological processes in ways that conventional medicine does not fully understand. Your healing patterns are consistent with someone who has learned to direct conscious will towards cellular reconstruction. Davidson found himself genuinely interested in the theoretical discussion, though he remained skeptical about explanations that relied on concepts like conscious control of healing processes. His experience with recovery from traumatic injuries felt more like adaptation than deliberate control. His body seemed to have learned from previous encounters and become more efficient at dealing with similar damage. "So you're saying I think myself back together?" Davidson asked, though his tone suggested he found the explanation incomplete rather than entirely incorrect. Kethvar's response indicated that the theoretical framework was more complex than simple mind-over-matter healing. The process appears to involve multiple factors working in coordination. Genetic predisposition provides the foundation for enhanced healing, but the efficiency and precision of your recovery suggests learned responses that have been reinforced through repeated exposure to traumatic injury. The examination continued with detailed analysis of Davidson's latest collection of scars, each one telling a story of the Kepler 442c extraction mission and the tactical decisions that had been required to complete the rescue operation successfully. The Havoc energy weapons had left distinctive burn patterns that were already showing the kind of systematic healing that had puzzled medical researchers. "Remarkable," Kethvar murmured, highlighting specific areas on the holographic display. "The cellular reconstruction is following the same patterns we observed in your previous injuries, but with improved efficiency. It's as if your body has developed template responses for dealing with specific types of damage." Davidson studied the displays with growing understanding of why his medical examinations had generated so much interest among coalition researchers. The evidence suggested that his healing capabilities were not just unusual, they were evolving, becoming more sophisticated with each encounter that required recovery from traumatic injury. "The implications for coalition medical treatment are significant," Kethvar continued, expanding the holographic models to show theoretical applications of similar healing processes. "If we can understand the mechanisms underlying your recovery patterns, we might be able to develop treatments that could benefit injured personnel from all species." The possibility of using his unusual characteristics to help other people was appealing, though Davidson suspected that such applications would require understanding that current medical science was not prepared to provide. His healing seemed to be the result of specific circumstances and experiences that could not be easily replicated in controlled conditions. "What would that involve?" Davidson asked, recognizing that Kethvar was leading toward a request for extended study rather than routine medical evaluation. Kethvar's response confirmed those suspicions. "Comprehensive longitudinal study would require monitoring your healing processes over extended periods, ideally including controlled exposure to various types of injury under laboratory conditions. The research potential is unprecedented." Davidson's reaction was the kind of polite but firm refusal that indicated he had no interest in becoming a permanent research subject. "I appreciate the scientific interest, Doc, but I've got other duties to attend to. Besides, I suspect my healing works best when it's not being studied under controlled conditions." The refusal was not unexpected, though Kethvar's disappointment was obvious. "I understand your reluctance, though I hope you will consider contributing to research efforts when your duties permit. The knowledge we could gain might help save lives throughout the coalition." Before Davidson could respond, the examination chamber's communication system activated with the kind of priority alert that indicated urgent messages from command. Captain Thainara's voice filled the medical bay with official tones that suggested another assignment was being prepared. "Sergeant Davidson, report to Briefing Room 3 for mission planning. Priority Alpha authorization." Davidson exchanged glances with Dr. Kethvar, recognizing that their discussion about extended medical research would have to be postponed indefinitely. Priority Alpha assignments were reserved for situations that required immediate response from personnel with specialized capabilities. "Duty calls, Doc," Davidson said, pulling on his uniform shirt and preparing to leave the examination chamber. "Maybe we can continue this conversation after the next mission." Kethvar's response carried the kind of resigned acceptance that marked medical professionals who had learned to work around the operational demands of military service. "Of course, Sergeant. I will continue analyzing your scan results and preparing recommendations for command regarding optimal utilization of personnel with your capabilities." As Davidson left the medical bay and headed toward the briefing room, he found himself wondering what kind of impossible mission Command had identified this time. The pattern was becoming familiar: medical examinations that revealed unusual capabilities, followed by assignments that tested those capabilities in increasingly challenging scenarios. The scars that had healed 3 times were about to face new challenges that would either prove the limits of human adaptability or add to the growing body of evidence that some individuals could transcend conventional understanding of what was possible. Davidson was curious to discover which outcome would prove correct. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his role in the coalition was evolving from individual soldier to something that might have broader implications for how human personnel were utilized throughout the Galactic Defense Organization. The medical evidence that puzzled researchers like Dr. Kethvar was also providing Command with new options for missions that had previously been considered beyond coalition capabilities. The briefing room doors slid open to reveal another collection of senior officers studying tactical displays and mission parameters. Davidson settled into the familiar routine of absorbing assignment details while preparing mentally for another encounter with situations that conventional wisdom would classify as unsurvivable. The cycle continued: impossible missions, traumatic injuries, miraculous recovery, and medical examinations that raised more questions than they answered. Davidson had learned to find satisfaction in the completion of assignments that others could not accomplish, even when those assignments came with prices that most people would consider unacceptable. As Captain Thaynara began outlining the parameters of his next mission, Davidson felt the familiar mental transition from routine duties to combat readiness. The scars that marked his body were about to be joined by new ones, following patterns that medical science could document but not fully explain. The healing would continue, as it always did, and when it was complete, Davidson would be ready for whatever impossible challenge Command assigned him next. The briefing room's tactical displays showed a situation that even Davidson recognized as exceptionally challenging. 3 coalition worlds had gone silent within a 48-hour period, with their last communications indicating coordinated attacks by unknown forces using technology that did not match any hostile species in coalition databases. The affected systems formed a strategic triangle that controlled major shipping routes and communication nodes, suggesting that the attacks were part of a larger operation rather than random raids. Captain Thaynara's expression carried the kind of grim determination that indicated she was about to assign personnel to missions with minimal chance of success. Intelligence suggests we are dealing with a previously unknown hostile force that has developed capabilities specifically designed to counter coalition defensive measures. Standard reconnaissance operations have failed to provide useful intelligence about enemy intentions or capabilities. The holographic displays showed orbital surveillance data from the affected systems, revealing the aftermath of attacks that had been both precise and devastatingly effective. Coalition defensive installations had been neutralized with surgical precision, while civilian populations appeared to have been evacuated rather than eliminated. The enemy was following strategic objectives that did not match known hostile species' typical operational patterns. "Mission parameters?" Davidson asked, though he suspected he already knew the general outline of what would be required. "Solo reconnaissance to determine enemy capabilities and intentions," Major Brekthar replied, consulting data displays that showed updated intelligence assessments. Standard operational doctrine calls for massed surveillance efforts, but enemy forces appear to be capable of detecting and neutralizing conventional reconnaissance assets. Davidson studied the tactical situation with growing understanding of why this assignment was being offered to him rather than specialist reconnaissance units. The enemy's ability to counter coalition surveillance technology meant that successful intelligence gathering would require someone who could operate without relying on standard equipment and procedures. The affected systems are heavily defended by unknown forces using technology that our best analysts cannot identify, Captain Thainara continued. Insertion will be accomplished using modified stealth capabilities, but extraction will depend entirely on your ability to avoid detection while gathering intelligence that conventional methods cannot obtain. The mission briefing continued with detailed analysis of what little intelligence was available about the enemy forces and their operational patterns. Davidson absorbed the information while running his own calculations about the likelihood of successful completion and survival. The assignment was clearly another example of command identifying situations that required capabilities beyond normal human limitations. As the briefing concluded and mission timelines were established, Davidson found himself reflecting on the conversation he had been having with Dr. Kethvar before the Priority Alpha alert had interrupted their discussion. The medical evidence of his unusual healing capabilities was clearly influencing Command's decisions about mission assignments, but he was beginning to wonder whether those capabilities were adequate for the challenges he was being asked to face. The scars that had healed 3 times were about to be tested against unknown enemy forces using technology that coalition science could not understand. Davidson was curious to discover whether his accumulated experience with impossible missions would prove adequate for this latest challenge, or whether he had finally encountered situations that exceeded even his enhanced resilience. Either way, he would soon find out. The cycle of impossible missions, traumatic injuries, and miraculous recovery was about to continue, adding new chapters to the growing legend of the human who specialized in making the impossible merely improbable. The medical bay's doors slid shut behind him as he left for final mission preparation, but Davidson knew that he would be returning to Dr. Kethvar's examination chamber soon enough. The question was whether he would be bringing new scars to add to his collection, or whether this mission would finally find the limits of human adaptability. Time would tell. It always did.